Welcome, everyone. This is Jeffrey Geisner from the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group. I'm again with Peter Kupfer, the author of The Glassmaker's Son, which will be soon to be published in November of 2022. Peter is a writer, editor, and photographer based in San Francisco. His articles on the arts and culture and other subjects have appeared in leading newspapers, magazines, websites, including the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the New York Observer. And again, welcome, Peter, to the Obligations of Memory podcast. And we're going to be talking about your book, The Glassmaker's Son. But in this episode, we're really going to be focusing on some specific portraits that became available in your quest to learn about your grandfather and your father. So why don't we start with a little bit of a background on how you came to, all right, let's stop.
Okay.
So Peter, maybe you can give us a little bit of the backstory about the portraits that you're going to share with us.
Sure, Jeffrey. So I went to my father's hometown shortly after he passed away for the first time. It was in 1979, and it was in a small city in Bavaria. I spent about 3 or 4 days there. I actually was intending to spend only a day or two, but I was having such an amazing experience, meeting people who had actually known my grandfather and even my father, and learning things about my family. For instance, one story I haven't even mentioned to you, Jeffrey, I don't think, was that my grandfather's house was one of the largest houses in town, and actually was taken over by the Nazis as their headquarters after they forced my grandfather to sell the house. But the thing of it is that after I returned to the United States from my trip, a few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. And it was a letter from a woman who was then about 90 years old, and she was blind. And she told me she had been a housekeeper in my grandfather's house, and that he had given her portraits of his parents, my great-grandparents, to safekeep after he was forced to sell his house and move to Frankfurt under the Nazis' policy of forcing, of prohibiting Jews to own property. But apparently my grandfather, something I'd never known about, my father had never told me about, and probably my father didn't even know this, because my father had already left Germany when this happened. My father left in 1937. And this was in 1939 that my grandfather was forced to sell his house. And he gave these portraits to his housekeeper for safekeeping. So this woman wrote to me and she said, I am so sorry. I didn't know you were in the city. If I had known, I would have wanted to meet you, because I've been holding these paintings for almost 40 years, waiting to return them to someone in your family. And I had no way of knowing how to reach anyone, because there was no one from my family that was left in Germany. And the reason she didn't know I was in Weiden, because they had written several articles about my visit in the local newspaper. But this woman, her name was Emma Fisher, was blind, and she didn't learn about my visit till after she had left. And in the letter, she said if she had known that I was there, she would have met me and she would have welcomed me into her house, and I could have stayed there, because I was actually staying in a youth hostel. I was a young man and didn't have a lot of money, and she said you would have been welcome to stay with me. So that's the start of the whole story.
So tell us a little bit about your trip to Secure, and why don't you talk about your great-grandparents who we're seeing on screen?
Well, okay, the woman on the left is my great-grandmother, Fanny Kupfer, and on the right is Edward Kupfer. Now, Edward was a very successful industrialist who ran a large glassmaking industry company. They actually owned several dozen glass foundries and associated businesses in Bavaria and Czechoslovakia, even in parts of Austria. It was a quite well-established company, quite prosperous.
Was there a name of the company that you know of?
There were several names. I mean, the name Kupfer, my family name, was in several of the companies, but there were, I mean, this was like a family business, and there was a very large family. So he was not the only, proprietor. There were several others. He was in partnership with a family called Glasser. And in fact, there's a lot of intermarriage because this was quite common in those days that, the Jewish families, there was a lot of intermarriage and intermingling of business and family. So anyway, he owned a large company and it had the name Kupfer in it.
Okay, and so tell us a little bit of how you came to secure the portraits and how your story got them back to the United States.
Well, after I received the letter from Mrs. Fisher, I wrote to her back right away, and obviously I was delighted to hear from her and to learn about these paintings, which I had no idea even existed. But unfortunately, I was not able to return to Weiden for almost 4 years. I, was a young man trying to, create my, carve out a career in journalism. I was didn't have a lot of resources at that point, so I wasn't able to return to Europe until 4 years later. And unfortunately, by that time, Mrs. Fisher had passed away. And I should also mention that during my first visit to Weiden, which is named the city, I met a journalist named Inga Robner, who has become a lifelong friend. And she was very instrumental in, first of all, connecting me with Mrs. Fisher, because Mrs. Fisher got all my contact information from her, and also in helping me to finally, reclaim the paintings. But Inga told me that Mrs. Fisher, when I got back to Weiden the second time, she told me that Mrs. Fisher unfortunately had passed away, and that the paintings had been inherited by a niece of hers because she had no children of her own. So Inga and I went over to meet the niece, who now had possession of my great-grandparents' portraits. And this woman, I won't mention her name, but she was quite poor. Inga told me she was one of the poorest women in town. She had a very sick husband. She had a lot of problems, and she was not very welcoming. But she had told Inga before I got there that she would give me the paintings back, that she would. But when we went to meet with her, apparently she had had a change of mind, and she told me she would not give them back unless I paid her 30,000 Deutschmarks, which I think was equivalent at that point to about $10,000. But as I say in my book, even if I had that money, which I actually didn't have, I wouldn't have paid her a pfennig, for these portraits, because these were my great-grandparents' paintings that had been only given to her aunt because of the Holocaust, because of the Nazi persecution. And I didn't, so I felt that, they were really belonged to me, and that, she shouldn't be demanding any payment for them. So to make a long story short, we left, And we actually went to go see the mayor of the city to ask for him to intervene. And in fact, he did try to intervene with this woman. He talked to her. The leader of the Catholic diocese actually met with her as well, trying to convince her to that she shouldn't really she should really surrender the paintings to their rightful owners, which were my family. But to make a long story short, this was back around 1983, and I left again empty-handed. And do you want me to continue with what happened?
Oh yeah, no time. Go ahead.
Okay.
I think it's a fascinating story.
By the way, let me
it brings in other things like reparations, and I'm sure you realize that many of our audience members could have and maybe are in the same situation that you are, having historical paintings taken from them during the Holocaust and searching. And I know for a fact, I did a program with Miriam Morris Friedman. Her father was the famous David Freeman, who was a Holocaust artist, and he lost many of his paintings were taken by the Nazis, and she's on a quest to find them around the world and bring them back to her proper ownership. So go ahead.
That brings up another point, Jeffrey, and that is that these paintings, they were portraits, and back in those days, this was not that unusual for affluent and maybe even just normal middle-class people to have portraits painted, because this was in the day when photography didn't exist or was in its infancy. So it wasn't, nowadays, of course, we have photographs to remember our history and our ancestors, but back then it was quite common. And the thing is, these paintings were not valuable in terms of being great works of art. This isn't a story about some valuable artwork. In fact, we had the paintings appraised. Inga had the paintings appraised, and by an art dealer in Munich, who said that they were nice paintings, but nothing special, nothing of any great merit. What the value was, of course, was for me was that they were my great-grandparents, and this was part of my family history. So it wasn't a matter of being of great monetary value, but it was obviously very valuable for my family and for me.
Before you get to the pictures, what is the picture on the left? That is a factory?
That's one of the factories my grandfather owned, and that was in his hometown in Weiden. And this was around the turn of the 20th century, I think, when this photograph was taken.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the Weiden Glassfabrik, I think they
When
call
you
it.
visited in 75, is it still upright?
Well, that's a whole nother story, but the day that I arrived, I think I might have mentioned this before, out of total coincidence, they had an article in the newspaper saying that the factory was going out of business, was closing down that very day. And I ended up wandering over to the factory that afternoon and being invited to attend the final meeting of the factory, the executives and some of the workers. And it was quite a moving experience. But yeah, that is the factory.
Anything that's came out of that board meeting that's a story for you to tell?
Oh my gosh, a lot came out of that meeting. I mean, first of all, I felt like I was in some kind of a movie where I'd walked into this room with all these kind of older, men, and I was sort of like thinking, and they were drinking beer and smoking, and I was kind of like this young, impressionable kid from the States thinking, oh my God, I've walked into like a nest of Nazis or something. It was like a weird feeling, but they were actually very welcoming to me. And it was a surreal experience. I mean, here I was, I didn't even know that this factory existed before I got there. And the day after I arrived, I'm sitting in the room with the board of directors of the factory my grandfather once owned. And not only that, but as I found out later, some of the men in that room knew my grandfather and remembered him and had worked with him. So it was really a surreal experience.
So tell us a little bit about the picture that, and the woman holding the picture.
Okay, well, so that's Mrs. Fisher, and those are the two portraits of Fanny and Edward that she had, and apparently she had tucked them away, wrapped them in cotton wool and rags and stored them away. But actually, I never saw the paintings because when I got there after she had passed away, her niece wouldn't even let me look at the paintings. I'm not sure why, but she said she had them stashed away somewhere and she didn't want me to see them. So I never actually got to see them until many years later.
So how did it unfold that eventually you took possession of the painting?
Okay, so as I said, I left after my second visit in 1983, empty-handed. And then over the years, Inga, the journalist in the local newspaper, and I would exchange emails and letters. But basically, after a while, I sort of just gave up. I'd actually contacted the American consulate in Munich as well to see if they might be able to help. And they said to me that, you would probably have to go through a complicated legal process. It might take years, it might take quite a bit of money to recover the paintings. And so I basically, for many years, I abandoned the whole, enterprise. And then I believe it was in it was many years later, maybe 15 or 20 years later, I happened to be in Munich with my cousin Eric, who grew up in Munich and was living in the States. And he was quite elderly and he wanted to go back to his hometown, probably for the last time. And it turned out it was the last time. But anyway, we were in Munich. I think this was around 2004 or 5. So obviously, like 20 years after that visit to the aunt or to the niece, and I decided to call Inga in Weiden and just to say hello. And so I called her, and while we were talking, she said, we really should find out what's going on with those portraits, whatever happened to them. So after I hung up, Inga started making inquiries. Turns out that the niece had died, and now the portraits had been inherited by her son, who was worked in the local bank. So I wrote to his son. Actually, my cousin in England wrote to him because he could write in German. And the response we got then was that he was willing to give them up only to sell them. He wouldn't, just like his mother, he wanted to sell them. And again, we were stalled. But then we got a letter from his wife a few weeks later with some shocking news. And that was that her husband had been killed in an accident, in a motorcycle accident, a motor scooter accident. And she was willing to give up the paintings. So that was what happened. And so a year after this, we went, myself and my cousin in Paris and my other cousin in England, the three of us met in Weiden, and we went to see the wife or the widow of the son of the niece of the housekeeper. Yeah, so it's a very involved story that took about 25 years from the time I learned of the existence of these paintings until the time we actually reclaimed them.
So how did you get them from Weiden to where you are in LA? So, or wherever you were at the time?
Well, I was in San Francisco living there as I am now. But what we decided, because there were, many descendants of Edward and Fanny who could, take possession of the paintings, I frankly decided I didn't really want to keep them in my house. I lived in a small apartment in San Francisco, and my cousin in England, we decided that, well, actually, we were thinking about giving them to a museum. We were thinking about maybe donating them to either a local museum or maybe a Jewish historical society somewhere. But then we decided that after, the portraits being separated from us for so many years, that they should stay in the family. And so we decided for the time being that we'd go to my cousin in England. And that's
Does he show them?
he has them hanging in his home in south of London. And, at some point they might go to another relative's house, but right now, Edward and Fanny are very happily ensconced in.
And what does your relative in England say of the responses of friends who come to visit them and see the portraits?
I really couldn't say for sure, Jeffrey, but I'm sure it's a subject of discussion. He's very happy to have them. I know my relatives in France are also have expressed interest in hosting Edward and Fanny. So we'll see what happens. I don't know if they're ever going to make it to the States, but we'll see.
Okay, and so I guess we'll conclude here. Tell us a little bit of what your plans are for the letters that you have from your father, and the process of how to go about it. I'm sure our audience has similar artifacts or
yeah, well, that's a
good
question. I've been in touch with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. I actually went there to do some research, and I met some people, and subsequently I've been in touch with them, and they are very interested in having the letters, and I'm more than happy to give them to them, which I will. I'm just holding off a bit till the book is published in November, because in case we might need to reproduce some of the documents. But I then am going to send them to the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, where, so they're very interested in any kind of original documents like that. So if any of your viewers and listeners are in possession of similar, materials, I would suggest that they contact the U.S. Holocaust Museum, or if not that, there's also Yad Vashem in Israel, or the Wiener Library in London, and wherever. And there are also smaller Holocaust museums around the country. I know there's one in Illinois, I believe, and in other cities, so in LA perhaps. And
So did you have any feeling of wanting to keep those letters for your family, or you didn't have that? I mean, I have 16 letters. We have copied them and had them translated through the copies, but my sister has possession of those letters, and she feels they're dearly part of something that she's not ready to give up.
no, I understand. Yeah, I understand that feeling, and I think that's totally up to each family and totally appropriate. For me, I mean, frankly, I don't have children. I'm a single gay man, so I mean, I do have some relatives that are interested in it, but I think the historical importance of them it's better served by having them in a, in a Holocaust memorial museum. To me, that will make them more durable and permanent.
Do they have a sense of what they plan to do with those letters? Or they become part of the digitized archive, or are they going to be on display, or have you explored that?
I think I haven't actually explored that. I'm assuming it's just going to be part of the archive. I mean, I don't know if there'd be any displays. I mean, it's possible, if they have certain exhibits that they might use them, but I think that it's a repository of probably millions of pages of documents or hundreds of thousands of pages of documents about the Holocaust.
Right.
So I'm not sure if it's anything more than for historical research and so forth.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Peter, for doing 4 episodes and to present your family story and even some not so on point stories for the Glassmaker's Son, the book that you're having published in November. And the publisher is again?
Amsterdam Publishers in the Netherlands, but it'll be available on Amazon as well.
Very good. And thank you, Peter, for spending so much time with us, and our audience, I'm sure, will enjoy it. I will make, if it's okay with you, your email address available, and anybody maybe want to contact you, and maybe you'll find some new relatives and new family through this process.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Take care now. Bye now. And bye to our audience. This has been the Obligation of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group on Facebook and YouTube. Bye now.